Are we waiting a couple more minutes, Alyssa?
Yeah, we're just getting started right now. So attendees are going to start to show up in the attendees tab. And so we'll give it just a few minutes and then we'll get started. Yes, I'd say you're probably good to go ahead and get started, and some more people will just trickle in as we keep going through.
Thank you, Alyssa. Good morning, everyone. I want to welcome you and appreciate everyone pivoting from a live event to a virtual webinar this year. Let's cross our fingers and be optimistic that next year we'll be able to do it live. I'm Darren Geiger. I'm the Director of Operations for the Grand Canyon Conservancy. I'd like to get us started by reading the Grand Canyon Conservancy Indigenous Land Acknowledgement, and then we will get into introductions and get things going. As an organization whose mission is to inspire generations of park champions to cherish and support the natural and cultural wonder of Grand Canyon Conservancy acknowledges that Grand Canyon National Park exists on land indigenous people have inhabited since time immemorial, and whose histories and cultures are indelibly tied to locations that are now located within national park boundaries. GCC accepts the responsibility of stewarding these places and pledges to honor and respect these lands, their cultural history, and the 11 nations that are still here. The Havasupai tribe, the Hopi tribe, the Hualapai tribe, the Kaibab band of Paiute Indians, the Las Vegas Paiute tribe, the Moapa band of Paiutes, the Navajo Nation, the Paiute Indian tribe of Utah, San Juan Southern Paiute tribe, the Pueblo of Zuni, and the Yavapai Apache Nation. With that, I'm Darren Geiger, Director of Operations. My highest priority with the Field Institute is to support the great team that we have and push forward the ideas that are coming up with, along with the operational oversight and budget responsibility for long-term growth of the Field Institute. My love of the canyon started around 24 years ago, 1998, when I did my first river trip with family and friends. And it was an experience where I got to hear firsthand stories of the wild river of the older days and some Georgie White stories. And to this day, that's what inspires me to do all the things I do at the canyon. I started with GCC in 2018, and it's my first experience with nonprofit, and I'm completely enjoying working for a mission and a purpose. Some things to know about me is every new trip or every new trail that I do, I record on my GPS, and my map is getting pretty full. So I've been having fun with that. Some adventures that I have coming up are up Boucher. I'm going to be doing a rim to rim, and I'm taking my daughter on her first river trip at the end of August with the Field Institute. And I hope it inspires her as it inspired me that long ago. And with that, I'll pass it on to Kay.
Hi, my name is Kay Tufts. I am the Logistics and Day Tour Specialist for Field Institute. I primarily oversee the scheduling and planning the logistics for our day tours, which are picking up in the next few months, which is exciting. I know a lot of our instructors are excited about that. Being new to the area, I've been working hard to explore and educate myself on Grand Canyon and the surrounding area. And I guess I'm just really looking forward to increasing and streamlining our day programming and our day tours. And with that, I'm gonna pass it over to Chris.
Hi, everybody. My name is Chris. I'm a program coordinator here at Grand Canyon Conservancy Field Institute. I primarily work with multi-day programming and river trips, logistics and planning, programming, everything that goes into putting those programs on. I'm relatively new to GCC. I started working here in last June, but I'm originally from Maine, but I've been living out here in the Southwest for well over a decade at this point, guiding, teaching, instructing, all kinds of stuff. I've been very fortunate to have spent a lot of time exploring Grand Canyon, and I'll have to say that my first real deep connection with the canyon from a real personal sense of place kind of connection was the first time that I went to Toroweep and waking up on the Esplanade overlooking that amazing part of the canyon was like the first thing that clicked for me. And from there, I've just developed a deep passion and love for this area. And if any of you ever have taken a trip with me, you know how much I love talking about it. It makes me really happy. I love it so much. I just love telling people all about it. So I'm really excited to everybody to be here and share our love of the canyon together. So with that, I'm going to throw it over to Laura.
All right, thank you. I first want to thank all of our panelists for joining us today, as well as everyone who is signing in on Zoom. We very much appreciate it, and we hope that today we are going to be able to ask questions. I'm going to introduce myself first, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about how today is going to go for all of those who are listening. So hi, my name is Laura Budelman. I am the Senior Program Coordinator here with Grand Canyon Conservancy Field Institute. Quick background on me. I actually started off doing AmeriCorps and trail work. I worked on all sorts of trails all over Arizona for about 3 years. And in the last 6 months of my last term with them, I was put at Grand Canyon. So I got to put in check steps, water bars on Bright Angel Trail and Clear Creek. And that started my love affair with Grand Canyon. From there, I shortly moved to the South Rim in about 2015. While I was at the South Rim, I worked with the National Park Service. I worked with Bright Angel Bikes. I was guiding throughout that whole time. I worked with GCC in our stores originally, and eventually came on to Grand Canyon Conservancy Field Institute, which was a dream of mine. You know, I'm sure we all know as guides, getting into things can be difficult. And here I am today. So for today, for Guide Training Seminar 2022, I want to talk a little bit about how it's going to go. Hopefully you all were able to watch the videos on YouTube, and we are going to be asking some questions. Some people were able to give us questions ahead of time, so we are going to do that. If you would like to ask a live question, we're going to ask that you put it in the Q&A chat box or the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Make sure to put it in the Q&A box, not the chat. They are different. That is so that we will be able to maybe even answer through type, or if multiple questions come in, we'll be able to ask that question to that presenter. Some other information, it is being recorded, just so you are aware, and this will be accessible after this weekend. So we will have it up live on YouTube as well, along with all of those videos. So you can rewatch things, come back, and we will do our best to answer all the questions. We might not have enough time to get to all of them. If we don't, and you left your voice or your email in the question submittal form, we can respond from there. This is a round table, so one person's going to go. We're going to ask a question, they're going to answer, and then we're going to go around in a round table. It's going to be it's going to end at noon. And for all of you listening, please take breaks, get up, stretch, get water near you. You can definitely take your time so that way you're comfortable. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Darren to introduce some speakers.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks, everyone. Let's get started. And first off today will be Teresa McMullen, our CEO of the Grand Canyon Conservancy. Take it away, Teresa.
Thanks, Darren, and thanks all of you for joining us. It's a beautiful morning here at the Grand Canyon, and really appreciate you taking the time on this Saturday. Grand Canyon Conservancy is the official nonprofit partner of Grand Canyon National Park. And we not only raise funds to support park priorities, but we also serve as an extension of the NPS staff through educational programming and through publishing. And so that's what the Field Institute is all about. We're about educational programming for visitors who come to the park, and whether it be a day tour or a multi-day backpacking trip or a river trip, we're here to provide those educational services. So we're really happy to have the Field Institute back. I want to thank the staff who's here today and who just introduced themselves and who worked on this first program that we're offering back here in 2022. We're so pleased to be back with a full slate of programming coming up this year. I also want to thank our panelists, and I want to thank all of our instructors who might be on the call too. We really appreciate you working with us. So I just want to give a quick overview of GCC and what we do, because I know some of you are new to us, but we are a membership organization, and our members and donors consist of individuals, corporations, foundations, and partner organizations. And we raise funds for park priorities. So that could be anything from the Desert View Intertribal Cultural Heritage Site to trail maintenance, to science projects like Dark Skies, and to preventive search and rescue, which helps keep people safe on the trails. We also offer retail shops in the park. We have interpreted merchandise that we sell. And if you're guiding and you need some resources, we're happy to help you find what you need in our stores. We're located at Kolb Studio, at the Verkamps Visitor Center, at the main visitor center, at Yavapai Geology Museum, in the tower at Desert View, and at the North Rim Visitor Center. So, during this interesting time in the park where visitor centers for the Park Service have been closed, our staff and our retail stores have really become experts on things about the park. And so they are a resource for you you can reach out to them anytime you need anything. So I just want to say that, Grand Canyon Conservancy is here to help the guiding community, and anything that we can do for you, we're happy to help. And with that, I would like to introduce this morning the Superintendent of Grand Canyon National Park, Ed Keeble. Thanks for joining us, Ed.
Thank you, Teresa, and thank you everybody for inviting me to join you. So my name is Ed Keeble. I'm the Superintendent of the Grand Canyon National Park. I'll just say a little bit about myself. This is my first Park Service job. I spent the previous 23 years working in the solicitor's office in the Department of the Interior, and spent the last 10 or 11 years as the senior career lawyer in the department. Somebody had the bright idea that I would be a good fit for the superintendency of the Grand Canyon, and Secretary of the Interior asked me to take this job on, and it took me less than half a second to say yes. I first joined or saw the canyon as a tourist in 1994, and was overwhelmed stepping up to the rim and looking at the amazing place that is the Grand Canyon, and felt kind of a spiritual uplifting just being here. And I had the random thought back in 1994 and again in 2003 when I visited as a tourist a second time to the North Rim, that this would be a great place to live and work. And 20 years after that, almost 20 years later, I'm living here and working with a great staff to preserve this place and make it available to the public. I think, or maybe I hope, that this being my first Park Service job, I bring a new perspective on leadership and ideas and how to manage this place and help that great staff I made reference to a minute ago do their jobs really effectively. And I'm having a great time doing it. The pandemic has been a bit of a challenge for the park for lots of reasons. We've had to make some very difficult decisions, including how we GCC manages the Field Institute. So I'm really especially pleased and grateful that we are back up and running in this program. I want to thank Teresa for her leadership through the pandemic with GCC. We have been true partners with GCC throughout the pandemic and for the entire time that GCC has existed. But the pandemic has tested our relationship, and I think it has made us closer and more effective as partners. One of the things that I've been impressed with as superintendent for almost 2 years now is the passion that so many people have for the Grand Canyon. And I really appreciate that passion and want to commend you for your engagement and your involvement and your passion for this place. Teresa and the team have asked me to give this group an update on some things that are going on in the park, and I'm happy to do that. I'll spend a few minutes updating you on a number of areas. So one thing I'll say is that late last year, the National Park Service got its first full-time permanent director in 5 years. We went through the entire Trump administration and almost the first year of the Biden administration without a director. But Chuck Sams is now the Senate confirmed presidentially appointed director. Chuck is the first Indigenous director of the Park Service, and he joins Secretary Haaland as the first Indigenous Secretary of the Interior. I have been in a number of meetings with Chuck, including one-on-one meetings, and my impression of him is that he is a very thoughtful, very strategic thinker, and is passionate about leading the National Park Service. And I think that bodes very well for the service for the next several years. Chuck has identified 7 priorities, and I just want to share them with you. The first is to connect and empower a thriving and diverse workforce. The second is to invest in the future of parks. The third is to confront the climate crisis using science and traditional ecological knowledge and stewarding our resources. The fourth is advance equity, inclusion, and access in carrying out the NPS mission. The fifth is respect and strengthening Indigenous connections and enhance our nation-to-nation relationship and fully uphold our trust and treaty obligations. The sixth is to create an NPS experience that meets visitor expectations into the future. And the seventh is to greatly improve, streamline, and modernize NPS management and business practices to ensure accountability to ourselves, our partners, and the American people. And I wanted to read those first because they're important as the director's priorities, but also because they remarkably align to the work that we've been doing in the park. The park established a 2020-2025 strategic plan a couple of years ago, and it's remarkable the synergy between the director's priorities and the priorities that this park, including an employee driven process developed and now is implementing. So I think that also speaks well for positioning the park in the next few years. One of those initiatives that I want to spend a little bit of time talking about is Indigenous Affairs. I looked at that strategic plan, and one of the, after a very short period of time, I realized that the history of this park created some real challenges, in part because of the way that we have treated Indigenous people. We took the park lands from them and forced them off the lands over a century ago, and we have effectively been managing the park in a way that excludes them from a place that they are connected to culturally and spiritually in ways that people from a Western-based background just aren't. And I believe that has done some damage to those communities. And so I've developed a separate Indigenous Affairs strategic plan for the park, tearing off some of the principles in that broader strategic plan. And we are busy implementing a whole series of activities to re-engage with tribal partners, building on some recent work before I got here to develop those relationships, including the work that we're doing with GCC at Desert View. So for a moment, I'll say that that Desert View project is, I think, a very innovative approach, not just at this park, but in parks generally across the nation. We are working with an intertribal working group of representatives from our 11 associated tribes and GCC to develop a vision for reimagining how we can work with our tribal neighbors in managing this park. GCC has been instrumental in raising funds for some construction projects to not just reimagine how we can manage, but also reimagine what the landscape looks like. So we're redesigning the landscape to promote this Indigenous supportive environment at Desert View. We broke ground in December of last year. With the first phase of the construction project, we are redesigning the amphitheater. We're expanding it and making it accessible and improving the look. If you've been to Desert View, you've seen the sort of tired old wooden benches. We're expanding that area just slightly to increase capacity, but we're also replacing it with stone benches that'll replicate a look similar to the amphitheater at Mather Point, if you're familiar with that. The Intertribal Working Group has established a theme for Desert View of We Are Still Here, and the park has embraced that theme and is working with them to educate Grand Canyon visitors to the manner in which Indigenous peoples have lived in this area, live in this area, and will live in this area. So it's going to be particularly important for us to integrate a tribally driven interpretive program at Desert View, in which tribal members will be doing much of, if not most of, the interpretation. And we are also trying to, in addition to educating Grand Canyon visitors about the Grand Canyon and the role that Indigenous people have had here, we're trying to educate them about the presence of and the vibrant communities that tribal people have in this area, and redirect Grand Canyon visitors to tribal parks and tribal communities to expand tourism opportunities in our tribal neighbor communities. That kind of broad and extensive collaboration with tribal peoples is not happening broadly throughout the Park Service. So we are leading the way in a very real and dynamic way here in the park for those kinds of engagements. My particular contribution to this Desert View vision is to expand it to the rest of the park. I had a conversation with a tribal member last year, and he had this concern that we were essentially creating a virtual reservation at Desert View by limiting the scope of tribal engagements to Desert View. And I assured him that we are working aggressively to extend the Desert View vision to the rest of the park. So as an example, we are in negotiations with a tribal entity to to take control of and manage the Tucson ruins and museum just west of Desert View. It looks like those negotiations are wrapping up for a first phase opportunity this year, this season, starting Memorial Day, for vending opportunities for Indigenous artisans at Tucson ruins for weekends throughout the season, so May to September. And from that, we hope to build an opportunity where tribal people will actually manage the site, interpret the site, manage the museum, help us figure out what the museum programming should look like, those sorts of things. We're also working at renaming Indian Garden to Havasupai Gardens. We've been working with the Havasupai tribe. That is an area in the park where Havasupai members lived until they were forcibly removed in the 1920s. And we are hopeful to get that name changed. We formally requested a name change with the Board of Geographic Names last October. That request is still pending. They've got a tremendous backlog, and we are progressing up the queue. I periodically ping them to find out where we are. So I hope at some point this year, hopefully early-ish this year, we will have that formal name change. And now we are working with the tribe to assess what the interpretive programming ought to be there, and to create a space for tribal members to have a constant presence there. We're also working with the Grand Canyon Trust on a program to develop a river training program for river guides that is respectful and honest interpretation of the Indigenous experience of the river corridor and in the park. And we're doing that kind of work with our interpretive and education resources program across the park. So we're integrating the work that Grand Canyon Trust is doing for the river program to the work that we're doing with the rest of the park. And finally, we've got some buildings in the historic village, including the powerhouse, which have either been not utilized or underutilized for some time and have therefore started to deteriorate. We are looking to get resources from the National Park Service to reinvest in those buildings, to stabilize those buildings so that we can create commercial opportunities, including with Indigenous economic development programs in some of our neighboring tribes, to extend that Desert View vision to the historic village. And then, of course, we'll do work similar to that on the North Rim, and I'll relate some of that in a few moments to some other work that we're doing on infrastructure. One of the areas that I've personally gotten very active in is Colorado River management. The Colorado River is, from a tribal perspective, the lifeblood of the canyon, and it's certainly a critical part from a park management perspective. Climate change has had a tremendous impact on the health of the river. I mean, from Wyoming to California, and certainly it has had that impact here in the park. The Secretary Haaland has appointed me to be the National Park Service representative to the Glen Canyon Dam Adaptive Management Working Group, which is a federal advisory committee act, which advises the Secretary on how to make decisions about managing the river, and particularly the river as it flows through the dam. I have been working in my time as the NPS representative to strengthen the relationships between the federal family members, the Fish and Wildlife Service, Bureau of Indian Affairs, U.S. Geological Survey, and of course the Bureau of Reclamation, which manages the dam. The work of that group has gotten increasingly difficult as climate change has impacted the availability of water. If you are at all following the news, you know that lake levels at Lake Powell and Lake Mead are dropping precipitously. That's creating all sorts of problems with respect to supply of water to the various users throughout the system for agricultural or municipal or industrial purposes. And it's also having an environmental effect. Here at the Grand Canyon, it is creating a number of different threats to the resources in this park, including endangered and threatened fish, the humpback chub, the razorback sucker. As the lake water levels drop, it's affecting the temperature of the water as it's coming into the canyon. It's also affecting the accessibility of the canyon to invasive predatory fish, which are creating threats to the humpback chub and the razorback sucker. And so the science and resource management team here that Sarah and Ann are members of is working very hard to protect those resources. We're also working as a park to try to protect the habitat, and including the sandbars in the park, which also support recreation activities with river visitors. And also the diminishment of sandbars is exposing archaeological resources, which is of concern to our tribal neighbors. So we've got a lot of interests that we are trying to address, myself, the science and resource management team here in the park, and the Park Service and other federal family members, and we'll keep a close eye on those challenges and continue to work to try to balance the NPS mission here, right? The Grand Canyon Protection Act, which Congress passed several years ago, requires the adaptive management group to pay attention to what's going on here in the park, and that has not gotten a lot of attention in recent years. So I'm elevating Grand Canyon Protection Act interests in those deliberations and with departmental leaders, so that the health of the park is factored into the overall health of the river. The next thing I'll talk about is that infrastructure issue. Last year, Congress passed and the president signed the Great America Outdoors Act, which funds $7 billion worth of infrastructure projects throughout the National Park Service. And the Grand Canyon is doing what we can to address what is a $750 million deferred maintenance backlog. And if you wonder what deferred maintenance is, I'll give you a sense of some of the things that we have successfully gotten resources, whether it's Great America Outdoors Act funds or line item construction appropriations, or money that the park has banked in our federal FLURIA program. We probably will spend $400 million over the next 5 to 7 years to replace the Trans Canyon water pipeline, which brings water to the South Rim, and also the pipeline that brings water to the North Rim. We have 4 wastewater systems in this park, 1 in the North Rim, 1 in Phantom Ranch, and 2 in the South Rim, 1 in the Historic Village and 1 in Desert View. All of that infrastructure, we're also replacing the electrical grid throughout the park. All of that infrastructure was built in the 1970s with a 25-year shelf life. And if you know your math, you know that we are well beyond a 25-year-old shelf life from the 1970s. All of that infrastructure is failing. All of that infrastructure was designed for a visitor population of 2 to 2.5 million visitors. And for the last several years, we've been well beyond that. In 1919, the last pre-pandemic year, we were up to 6.4 million visitors. During the pandemic, we were between 3.5 and 4.5 million visitors, 1920, 2020, 2021. And so that whole infrastructure needs to be completely replaced. So we are about to launch into a tremendous construction program here in the park to address those needs. We are starting that process this year. by expanding the park helibase, which is near our facilities management area. We need to do that because we will be, that'll be the location where many of our construction partners will be working from, and we need to create space for them. We also need to expand our helibase because over the course of the construction for all of those projects, we will be increasing the use of helicopters throughout the park during the duration of all of those programs, those construction programs. I'll give you a sense of what I'm talking about. So in terms of a schedule for construction, the South Rim support facilities, as I mentioned, has started. It's starting this week with the helibase. We're going to be spending $5 million on that. The South Rim electrical substation, we're going to start moving and repairing and rebuilding, and that's going to cost $12 million. That's starting this spring as well. The Trans-Canyon water line is a $104 million project. That's starting. We hope to have the construction award in the fourth quarter of 2022. The 4 wastewater systems I identified, the South Rim system is going to cost $35 million, and we'll start construction there in September 2022. The South Rim Desert View wastewater system will replace at $13 million in the 24-25 timeframe. The North Rim will also be in that same timeframe. In fact, we have a whole North Rim infrastructure program that's going to cost $102 million. That wastewater system is part of that. We're also replacing all of the water lines and doing some other construction on the North Rim, which may create us for us the opportunity to expand operations in the North Rim. Currently, we operate from May to October because the systems up there are not winterized. So we are winterizing the infrastructure as part of the planning for the North Rim operations. So it's possible in the next few years we could increase the season either by expanding the shoulder seasons or by going year round at some point. We have a housing challenge I'll get to in a moment, which is an additional limitation for our opportunities in the North Rim. And then there's the historic village. I mentioned earlier that that's an opportunity for us to expand the Desert View Vision to the historic village. In order to do that, we need to spend $50 million to upgrade the buildings I made reference to. I have a proposal pending before the National Park Service Investment Review Board to seek that investment right now. So we'll have an answer from the IRB sometime late this spring, I'm guessing. There will be impacts for all of this construction. We won't know the full extent of those impacts until we have actual construction contracts, and we will negotiate the schedule of construction with those contractors. But I have made some preliminary decisions to maximize the coordination of those activities to minimize the impact on the ground to visitors. That'll include Phantom Ranch. Phantom Ranch has been operating at 50% capacity for over a year now because the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality has been concerned about the capacity of our wastewater system to support the number of visitors that we've had because it's too old and in such need for repair that we haven't been able to operate at 100% capacity at Phantom Ranch. We hope to have a temporary fix this year for that system, which will theoretically allow us to increase access to Phantom Ranch, including the Xanterra hotel operations and the Bright Angel campground opportunities. We may not fully extend to 100% because we need to start supporting the contract activities. And depending on the timing of the contractor activities, we may dedicate increased capacity to Phantom Ranch to contractors. But we will keep our visitors fully informed as soon as we know what these impacts are. we will let people know. Some of the impacts will be trail closures as the Trans-Canadian water line is constructed, and it follows to a great extent the line of the Bright Angel Trail. And so there will be points at which, for small periods of time, we'll have to close the trail to facilitate contractor activities. As I said, we're trying to minimize that by aligning contract activities, and hopefully we'll not constrain our hikers too much on Bright Angel. But again, we'll keep people apprised of what we're doing as much as we can. Another development here in the park is that we are actively working to recruit park river operators. After the sexual harassment scandals of the middle 2000 teens, the park ceased managing river operations, and we've been contracting out those services. So I'm referring to the administrative river operations that the park runs and the law enforcement activities that the park runs. Those are two separate operations, but we are recruiting for boat operators for both those operations, and hope to have NPS boat operators on the river this summer. This is an important development for the park, both because the river is an integral piece of what we do and all of our administrative programming on the park, and we need to effectively control that better than we are able to with contractors, and it'll also be less cost effective. So it's also important that the park doesn't contract out such an incredibly important part of our programming. So I'm pleased that we've managed a number of reforms of those operations, and are launching those that effort this summer. There remain a number of challenges here in the park. I'll just highlight a couple of them for you before I close. Housing is a problem for parks in the West throughout the system. Director Sams has identified housing as a priority, and I am actively engaged with a working group with the Washington office to develop ideas and strategies for expanding housing opportunities for parks generally, and for this park in particular. I'm working with the Navajo Nation to identify possible opportunities for housing in the Cameron area that might support the park, and there may be opportunities in the town of Tucson as well, and working with Mayor Vail in that. The park's budget is heavily reliant on fees, and during the course of the pandemic, when our visitor rates dropped, our budget was adversely affected. And so I'm working on strengthening our fees, strengthening our budget, our ONPS base budget. And one of those priorities is to enhance science. And so as I strengthen the NPS budget, I hope to strengthen the science program. One of the challenges I inherited as I came into the park 2 years ago was a science and resource division that, as talented as it is, it's smaller than it should be. We need more scientists, so that as I make decisions and make recommendations to policymakers in Washington, I'm making those decisions and making those recommendations on the best available science. So I'm working with Sarah and her team to identify what those priority needs are so that we can start funding them. I was able to get almost $250,000 to increase funding in the science programming for the current fiscal year. Unfortunately, that opportunity is delayed by the continuing resolution. We don't have a current year budget. We're working on a continuing resolution, which requires us to spend at last year's levels. So that $235,000 isn't something we can lean on until we actually get a budget. So Sarah and her team are planning on how to spend that money as soon as we get it. And I'm looking for other opportunities to fund science. I had an interesting meeting recently with GCC about opportunities where they may be able to help us increase science funding. I also had a meeting earlier this week I haven't had a chance to debrief Sarah about, so this will be news to her, about accessing the carbon market and its offsets for increasing funding to the park. And if we are able to do that in the course of the next few years, strikes me that science programming would be a high priority for trying to figure out how to take advantage of any increased revenues. So that's a lot. I hope that gives you a sense of some of the great work that we're doing here in the park, some of the challenges that we have that we're working through. I again want to thank Teresa and the GCC team because they have been invaluable partners for us as we've worked through these challenges, and you know, the great team that we have, like Sarah and Ann, who are on the phone. I keep telling my staff, this is a great time to be at the Grand Canyon National Park, and I'm excited to be here. I'm happy to take any questions if anybody has any.
Thank you, Ed and Teresa. That does bring us to our next part where Darren's going to ask some questions that we do have. And if those on the call want to type in things, we'll be able to do that. And we're going to do this till about 10:30 to 10:35. Go ahead.
Thanks, Ed and Teresa. Thank you, Laura. Really quick, Ed, can you touch base on in insights and impacts? You talked about the Glen Canyon Adaptive Management Group. Can you share a broader perspective of who's involved in that group and some of the activities that you'll be participating in around that?
Sure. So we call the group AMWIG for the Adaptive Management Working Group. So AMWIG is a Federal Advisory Committee Act, and its role is to give advice to the Secretary of the Interior on how to manage the Glen Canyon Dam. So we're essentially talking releases of water from the dam and what the schedule is. That question of when and how to release water through the dam has impacts on the health of the river south of the dam, so in the Grand Canyon and feeding into Lake Mead. As the climate change impacts that's the system, the whole basin, those decisions become increasingly challenging. The members of the AMWIG include state, tribal, and local representatives, water districts, and such. And as I said, their goal is to help reclamation make decisions on how much water and when to release water from the dam. Ultimately, the secretary is responsible for that. She's delegated that authority currently to Wayne Poulin, who's the Upper Colorado Regional Director for Reclamation, a former client of mine, a good friend of mine. He's a friend of the park. He's been to the park since I've been here hiking the Tonto Trail, and so my role as a Park Service representative is to make sure that the Park Service interests are understood by the committee members and that our interests are factored in this, and to help sort of think globally about how to look at the basin as a unit as we're making decisions. So, for example, one of the things that Wayne does is he manages other dams in the system, including Flaming Gorge Dam in Wyoming and Aspinall Dam and some other dams. And so one of the things that Reclamation is considering is releasing water from those dams to increase the lake level of Lake Powell, because Lake Powell is a threat in the next couple of years to go below dead pool. And that's the level at which the water goes below the turbines, and the turbines aren't going to be able to operate anymore and create electrical energy. So lots of threats, lots of challenges, and we're working through in a collaborative way how to resolve water allocation issues throughout the system and dam operation issues.
Thank you, Ed. Appreciate that. Teresa, what are some of the smaller GCC projects you are most excited to see completed in 2022 and beyond?
That's a great question, Darren. You know, so much of our work is ongoing, like trail maintenance that we'll always be working on, and So I think, as I think about that, Ed had mentioned that work has started at Desert View on the amphitheater, and that will be completed this spring. And so, that's just one of the many facets of the Desert View site that we'll be working on this year. The Tribal Welcome Center will be coming up next, and then there's an orientation area and new pathways and new restrooms and parking lot reorientation and several things. But I think seeing that amphitheater completed that'll be a big milestone for us.
Great, thank you. There's a question on chat about Desert View interpretation. And it's around the Mary Coulter history, and if there are any changes in potential interp with some of the questions around Mary Coulter's contributions in the past. And it's my understanding from conversations I've had that there are no changes anticipated with interpretation of the Desert View. Do either Teresa or Ed have any additional input on that?
Yeah, what I would say about that is that we are working with the Intertribal Working Group to assess what the interpretive programming should be at Desert View, and we're still working through those issues. They're in particular going to focus on what the Indigenous interpretation opportunities are, what the message is, how it'll be delivered, where it'll be delivered, who will deliver it, those sorts of things. There will still be other interpretation at Desert View, and I wouldn't write off some interpretive opportunities about Mary Coulter there, in part because Mary Coulter was innovative in using Indigenous people and collaborating with Indigenous people to develop the design and implementation, the construction of that program, and the relationship she had with the artisans there, I think, was important. If you've been in that watchtower, it's a remarkable piece of art. The interior spaces is just remarkable. And Mary Coulter worked with Indigenous artisans to make sure that it was a good representation of local Indigenous culture. And she worked closely with the artisans who painted those murals. So I would think that Mary Coulter will be part of the narrative that we have for interpretation of that place.
Thank you for responding to that, Ed. Appreciate that. On a more fun note, what is some of the great places you've seen at the North or South since you've been visiting here?
I guess I would say all of it. It gets to it sort of reminds me of the question of who's your favorite child. There's sort of certainly not a favorite place I have here, but every place I've been has been remarkable. Whether it's the confluence of the Little Colorado River to the Colorado River, or Imperial Point on the North Rim, or any place I can think of that I've been. This is such a remarkable landscape, and as I alluded to in my introduction, I certainly get a sense of the divine here everywhere I go, and I guess I'd say two things. One is I've had the opportunity. I've got the great benefit of having access to 2 helicopters and a fixed-wing airplane to get around the park, and so I've flown all over the park, in addition to hiking in the park and rafting in the park. And when you're in the air over the park, you get a sense of really how grand the Grand Canyon is. So that's a special experience. But also, since Sarah's on the line here, I'm going to say that one of my favorite experiences in the park was hiking the Hermit's Trail with Sarah and her paleontology team. We did a paleontology field briefing, and I had the fortunate opportunity to invite my husband, who was visiting the park. He doesn't live here, And so we went hiking down the Hermes Trail. It was a great experience, learned a lot about paleontology and the way in which our scientists study fossils here. And Sarah and Scott each found fossils dating 280 million years old. Sarah found a bigger one that was split in half. She found both halves. Scott found one that was whole. It was interesting to get an insight into Sarah and how competitive she is as they debated which had the better find. But when you get on a paleontology field trip and you get two people who find 280 million year old fossils, that's a particularly fun day. So there are all sorts of experiences like that I've had in the park as superintendent, and every day I walk the South Rim Trail to get to work, and I feel inspired by it, and I'm reminded of my responsibilities by my walk to work, and I just never tire of being here and being part of this what I call my Great Grand Canyon adventure.
Thank you. That was great, Ed. And in speaking with Teresa, I know she often says when you ask her that question, it's wherever she is now. But can I put you on the spot, Teresa? And can you highlight?
Well, I'll also say, I was going to say one thing. I was once asked what my favorite place is, and before Teresa, I will say that my favorite place might be the South Kaibab Trailhead after hiking up from Phantom Ranch.
Teresa, would you like to share one of your two favorite places? I think we're running out of time, so I wanted to have some fun questions.
Oh, thanks for that. I'm kind of like Ed. And you hit it. Whenever anybody asks me, I always say it's wherever I am, because wherever you are in this park, the landscape is so stunning, and there's so much to see, and there is a sense of spirituality throughout the park. And I'll just say that I've had the opportunity to spend a lot of time on the trails and on the river, and even have been able to get up in the air with Ed a couple of times and see it from the helicopter and the plane. And it always takes my breath away. There isn't a time that I don't look over the rim, and it just takes that moment to just say how fortunate we are to be here, and fortunate to be here to do the work that we do. So.
Yeah, and I'll just say, if you ever are out in the landscape for a camping or river adventure, you want to be with Teresa McMullen, because she can haul gear and pitch tents like nobody's business.
I can catch them in the wind too.
I want to thank both Teresa and Ed for joining us today. I do not see any more questions in the chat. If we did miss something, we will get back to you. And I believe I'll turn it back to Laura.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ed and Teresa. We very much appreciate it. I know Ed is going to leave us from here, and I believe Teresa as well. So up next is going to be our panelist video Q&A. So once again, we're going to do it in a round table section, or round table, and I'm going to give you the order in which we're going to go. It's going to be Dr. Tom Myers first, and then we're going to move to Jack Staus and Eric Vulcan. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your last name there. Okay. And then we're going to move to Ann Miller with MPS, and then Sarah Haas with MPS, and then we're going to go to Joel Barnes from Prescott College. And we're going to go in that order, one question per person. And this is also your time to put some questions into the Q&A chat. And with that, we are going to start off with the next round, and we're going to start with Dr. Tom Myers.
Okay. Dr. Tom Myers, we actually have a question in the chat for you, so I'm just going to read it and have you answer as necessary. Todd put in the chat, you mentioned that a sign of hyponatremia is frequent urination. I thought I saw somewhere that in advanced hyponatremia that the body can start retaining fluids. Is that right?
That's correct. That's one of the problems with trying to diagnose hyponatremia versus dehydration. When it becomes further down the pathway toward a seriousness. When you retain fluid, you dilute out your body's sodium. Unfortunately, there's a paradoxical reaction that happens within the brain. It's involves the pituitary gland, and it secretes inappropriately a hormone called antidiuretic hormone. And that hormone does just what it says. It stops diuresis or urination. Usually it's driven by the concentration of particles in the bloodstream, the serum osmolality. But in this case, the blood is actually dilute. But there's a trigger that allows the body to secrete more of this antidiuretic hormone. And so what happens is people will stop urinating, or the urination will become far less in volume and frequency. And then the problem is, are they dehydrated, or are they actually hyponatremic? And so to make the diagnosis, you really have to rely on a good history. Look, I know you've stopped urinating, but you've drank 4 liters in the last 4 hours. And so you have to have a suspicion that the urination with a known history of high fluid consumption, that urination stopping may actually be hyponatremia and not dehydration. So it's a great question, and unfortunately it trips people up all the time.
Great, thank you. Our next question is for Jack and Eric from Glen Canyon Institute. Someone asked beforehand, is it possible for arc sites that were buried within Glen Canyon under Lake Powell to be intact now that Glen Canyon is restoring itself? And in your visitation and research in Glen Canyon, have any arc sites been discovered recently?
So that's a really great question. A lot of the structural sites that have come out of water since the reservoir has come down have been damaged pretty badly. And it kind of depends on how long they were inundated for. There are sites, there's a rock art panel in Lower Cataract Canyon that was once covered by the reservoir, and that is out of water and looks pretty undamaged. It's really hard to tell that it was ever inundated. So there are some areas where they have emerged unscathed, and then there have been other structures, granaries and stuff like that that have come out that they're still there, and you can see where they were, but they were pretty damaged by the reservoir, unfortunately.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I'm going to move on to Ann Miller. We've got your first question is, you mentioned that you mentioned that there hasn't been an extensive geologic study of the Hermit layer since 1929. Do you have any insight as to why it hasn't been studied extensively since then?
Well, that's a good question. I honestly think the main reason why a lot of the Grand Canyon hasn't been studied is because a lot of people think that it has been studied. So it's so famous and it's so well known in geology that a lot of geologists and paleontologists tend to assume that it's been really well studied. But in fact, we have a lot of gaps in our studies. A lot of the studies, especially in paleontology, have occurred in the 20s and 30s, kind of when Eddie McKee was around and a lot of those different famous paleontologists. So yeah, now with that kind of knowledge, knowing that it's very understudied, a lot of those research projects are starting to ramp up now. Just knowing that, there's a lot of gaps in our research. So hopefully that answers the question.
Nice. So it goes back to some good history there of Eddie McKee and understanding what was studied and lack of knowledge. Thank you. So up next is Sarah. Sarah, your question today is, when bison are relocated, do you take into account which bison are being removed? And does removing certain bison affect the function of the herd?
Hi, everybody. That's a great question. And we do take into account which bison are being removed. We've been putting some collars on bison to do a study of their movement patterns over the last several years when we are corralling them and moving some bison off of the park. So some of those collars have to be, put on certain animals, and they're the adults, sometimes they're bulls, sometimes they're cows. So that will depend on, kind of what data we want to get. We generally have tried to keep family groups, as much as we understand them, together when they ship out. So cows and calves, to the extent that we can, and we can identify those groups. Bison are very intelligent animals, and removing some bison, especially the older females or the older members of the group, can definitely, affect the group dynamics. It's hard for us to know exactly what that translates to on the ground, because there's a lot of shared knowledge between the bison and the herd. But we understand that, by moving them and separating them, that can affect the group dynamic. So we do try to keep those family groups, especially the young with the cows, together as much as we can.
Thank you, Sarah. It's always interesting. I never quite think about the dynamics of the interrelationships in a bison herd. So thank you for asking, for those who asked that question too. All right, I'm going to pass off to Chris.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Joel, this question is for you, and Jack and Eric, you might want to chime in on this too, I think, and anybody else who has some insight. So in your presentation, you mentioned the interconnectedness of an arid landscape is deeply rooted in its flowing waters. And Jack from Glen Canyon Institute mentioned how many important seeps, springs, and smaller tributaries were covered in the creation of Glen Canyon Dam / Lake Powell. How would you quantify and lead discussions around this type of loss, so when we are guiding, we can navigate helpful conversation with participants that don't leave impending doom feeling of catastrophic climate change?
All right. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question, because those of us who are involved in outdoor education and and we're fielding questions from participants about how bad is it, and it's easy to focus on how bad it is. And there is this notion of gloom and doom environmental education that was kind of part of the literature back in the 70s, realizing that's what we had been doing in the 60s, is telling third graders how we are deforesting the tropical rainforest and how that was like messing up their worldview. So gloom and doom environmental ed is really not that successful. It bums people out. So what you want to do is, as an educator, you kind of want to have a plan, and this plan should really be setting a taproot of awareness and appreciation first. Get somebody to fall in love with a place, then you can slowly bring them along to where they have the inspiration and the love for a place to tackle the tough issues. But if you go straight to the tough issues first before they love the place or understand how it works, then you're kind of not giving them the tools to really grapple with these incredibly complex issues. And that's what we did back in the 70s with environmental ed, and we realized it wasn't working. It just bums people out. So as outdoor instructors, Grand Canyon Field Institute and Conservancy guides, we're really in the position to set that taproot of awareness and appreciation first, and to have a plan, for helping your participants really connect emotionally and experientially with the landscape before you start to expect them to really tackle the big issues. And of course, quantifying it, you can always quantify stuff, right? There's all kinds of research out there on, and I'm sure that that Eric and Jack have read stuff about how, I think it was Larry Stevenson, one of his books, said that really a landscape like the Grand Canyon, really riparian areas account for 0.03% of the total landscape, a very small sliver, yet they support over 30% of the biodiversity. And in fact, when it comes to mammals, it's up to 80% of the mammal diversity are either directly or indirectly reliant on this 0.03% of the landscape. So they truly are a keystone habitat, and they really help hold an arid landscape together. So you can quantify it, and that's important sometimes to bring in numbers. But I think equally as important is is really helping them to connect, like I said, emotionally, experientially with the landscape. And in fact, I sent Chris an article that I wrote a number of years ago that focuses on the importance of having a sequence in mind as an educator, to not go straight to the really complex, sometimes ethically confounding issues of place, but help your students to really connect with a place through emotions and experiences and senses before you have them trying to understand the complex issues.
That's great, Joel. Thank you. Eric, Jack, anybody else like to chime in on this important topic?
Yeah, I would just add to that. I think Joel had a great answer, and just kind of honing in on this, the concept of the riparian corridors. In Glen Canyon specifically, they're just such a miraculous place of rebirth. And as the kind of macro picture of the Colorado River Basin changes to a more drier picture, which can sort of give you a negative view of everything. In the heart of it, in Glen Canyon, with so many riparian tributaries coming into the canyon, those are the areas where you see the restoration happening the fastest. You're seeing the flora and the fauna come back, and really coming back faster than anybody thought they would. And so it's just important to remember that even though the basin as a whole is drying, there's still a lot of water in the desert where it needs to be. And life can rebound so quickly and so impressively with just a small amount of water. So, I think looking at those riparian corridors and really taking stock of the rebirth and restoration that happens there. And of course, this is similar in the Grand Canyon with tributaries with water. I mean, the amount of life that's there is just fascinating. So I think it's important to focus on those places of rebirth and regeneration.
I think you're right. Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Jack.
I was just going to say, to follow up with that, we had a question in the chat box about what is coming back in these restoration zones in terms of native flora and fauna versus non-native. And I just want to add, I mean, for the sake of kind of boots on the ground research that we've done there so far, and it's still kind of preliminary because this is changing pretty rapidly. We've seen a pretty amazing amount of native plants come back in terms of just like, what you'd sort of expect to find in riparian areas. And the scientists that we've been down there with they're surprised, but they're also not that, it's not that shocking to them, because they know that these habitats should be resilient with the amount of available water coming out of these seeps and springs. So I don't know if I could say exactly the amount of native versus non-native, but there are some non-native species, tamarisk, for example, that really do like habitats like the Domini Formation, for example. But in some of these lower canyon, side canyons that have reemerged, we see a huge amount of willows and even cottonwoods starting to come back, flowers, birds, insects as well. So it's a pretty amazing transformation. We're even seeing some cryptobiotic soils coming back in the upper canyon.
That's awesome. Good to hear. Yeah, that's really good to hear. Thanks everybody. Kay, you're up. There's a great question in the chat for Tom.
Yeah, this is a good question in the chat. So this question is from Jordan, who is a program manager for a backpacking company. And Jordan said, in Grand Canyon's hot months, our guides frequently encounter non-client hikers in hyponatremic distress. What would be the ideal method for assisting these hikers? And then Jordan goes on to list possible options like a mixture of water with a packet of sodium, potassium, magnesium, salty snacks, soy sauce or ramen flavor packet. And does the intake of a half a liter of water along with these options make the situation worse?
Okay, well, let's start with if they're pretty confident about the hyponatremia diagnosis, yes, giving that half a liter with electrolyte packet in there would be a bad idea. So first thing that should be done is try to make, feel confident that you've got the right diagnosis. If somebody you come across is in distress, first thing you do is try to get in the shade and cool them off in those hot summer months, and then get an adequate history on their fluid intake. You ask about food intake as well. If they're not eating and they're drinking a lot of water, think hyponatremia. And then, depending on how nauseated they are and if they're throwing up, what you can do is try to give them salty snacks. But first off, cool them off, get them in the shade, get the history, and then sort of test the water, so to speak, with oral salty snacks. I think those are easier than trying to create a slurry with, say, soy sauce or even the ramen packets. You can do those are great, but I would caution people on asking the hyponatremia person what they think they might want to eat, what they might want to be able to tolerate, what they're hungry for. If I try to force a ramen packet, even a sort of hyper concentrated that or soy sauce, and somebody's already nauseated, which hyponatremia causes, I might cause them to throw up and make the situation worse. And so I would, just kind of feel it out a little bit. It's like, do you feel like you tolerate anything orally right now? And if they can't, then I'd wait. And I'm just like, all right, we've stopped you from drinking more fluid. We've cooled you off, so you're not sweating as much. You're losing less sodium in your sweat. And we're going to wait till you feel like maybe you could try some salty snacks. The problem too, it's correcting it. It can take hours and hours. So it depends on how much time the guide may have to interact with somebody who's not with their group. But yeah, so that's how you approach it with trying to give them electrolytes in other forms like drinks and stuff. That's out, because usually those, to make them palatable, you get more water than you actually get sodium. And so it can actually make the situation worse. So the ramen packet, I'll leave with this one. The ramen packet is a good one to consider trying, maybe a little on their fingertips or their tongue. Just get some of that salt in there. Maybe you can make a little bit of a slurry with a little water, but definitely want to make sure you don't give them more water.
Great, thank you, Tom.
Sure.
This next question is for Eric and Jack from Glen Canyon Institute. We have a question that was pre-submitted, and the question is the restoration of the Colorado River unique to this area, or could this situation be applied to other areas experiencing a similar situation? And they follow that up with, could this type of restoration be comparable to what happens during dam removal?
I think we do see a lot of similarities with the restoration of the main stem Colorado River with what you would see kind of like, I guess the other example would be like the Elwha River is probably the most popular. That when the Elwha Dam was removed and the Glines Canyon Dam, that river corridor repaired itself pretty quickly. But the scale is quite a bit different. Lake Powell is the second largest reservoir in the country. There's a lot more sediment in the Colorado River, and that creates different challenges. So I think any river given the chance to restore itself will do it over time. The big caveat here is, the sediment really. I think depending, if you were to completely phase out Glen Canyon Dam as a, storage facility, I think the potential for restoration is really big, but there's so much sediment in at least the upper reaches of the reservoir around height. Those sediment deltas that are there, they're probably going to be there for hundreds or thousands of years. It's unlikely that those will wash away with any sort of spring flooding, but the other restoration patterns that we've seen in Lower Cataract Canyon, Upper Glen Canyon, that could translate really through the rest of the canyon, with the exception of the river choosing new channels through the sediment deposits. So I think that you do see this type of restoration happening with other rivers and dam removal projects. It's just, there's a lot more sediment here. And, just to close off the idea, if we did get all of Glen Canyon back, when it was full, it was a 186-mile reservoir. So to my knowledge, this would probably be the largest river restoration site in the world. So a very different scale.
Great, thank you. Jack, do you have anything you would like to add?
I think just a lot of the stuff that we've seen, particularly in the kind of side canyon tributaries down in the middle of the reservoir in Glen Canyon, the scale that some of these just 1 or 2 monsoonal flash floods have removed sediment at is what I would consider unprecedented. Banks that we have no metric to know how fast they should remove, but stuff that was piled up 40 feet or more washed out in 1 or 2 cycles. So I think that's pretty unique to the desert Southwest, and it's really exciting to see some of these features coming back from under what many would have thought to be a devastating amount of sediment.
That is exciting. Thank you. I'll pass it to Laura.
Thank you. All right, Anne, you are up next. You mentioned that the same dye can be found in many places in the canyon. Would you be able to talk a little bit more about what that underground network of caverns and that karst system might like visually look like to allow this to happen?
Sorry, having trouble with my microphone. Yeah, that's actually a question that we as scientists are trying to envision ourselves. We're trying to envision this network of pathways and caves, and it's difficult, of course. But what we get so far is that the sinkholes are connected to fault systems, and those fault systems are then connected to springs. So if you want to kind of envision where water's going to go, it's going to start off in some of these big sinkholes that are on the north rim on the Kaibab Plateau. And the water is going to infiltrate that and follow certain pathways in fault systems that lead towards places like Roaring Springs, or some fault systems also cross perpendicular, and the water will then follow that pathway to the sides of the canyon, and sometimes follow towards the east, sometimes towards the west. So it's a very complicated system, and it's still something that we're trying to visualize ourselves. But hopefully this dye trace project in the future, as we collect more data, can give us that picture. And I mentioned in my talk as well that there's a graduate student, a PhD student, who is working on getting that 3D model of the aquifer system. And that's a very complicated thing, of course, but he's using Lidar data, and he's going to be using areas like cliff faces, mapping out fault systems, and where different cave systems are. And we're hoping that with that data, we're going to be able to have a really nice picture of what that internal aquifer system looks like. So I can't answer the question perfectly, but
that's okay. It's an evolving science. We did have a follow-up question too. What is Lidar technology? Could you just talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. It's I'm not an expert in Lidar, so I'm still trying to understand it myself. But it's essentially, you have an aerial image of the ground surface, and you're able to actually get rid of things like vegetation when you look at it in GIS. And so with that, you're able to actually view things like fault systems, the rocks beneath all the vegetation cover that geologists kind of get frustrated with sometimes, trying to see the rocks underneath. That's the best way that I can explain what the use is going to be for us, is to be able to see underneath that vegetation. But we can also see very closely what that vegetation looks like as well. So it's helpful for things like our vegetation program too.
Oh, thank you. All right, so Sarah, you are up next. Sorry, let me move my, we've got a question that came in. What other alternatives to reducing the bison population were or may be considered in the future versus lethal removal? For instance, is there a viable strategy focused on birth control?
That's a great question. So the environmental assessment from 2017 did look at several strategies, including birth control, and it was eliminated as a viable option. It's not completely 100% effective. It's incredibly costly, and this herd isn't completely contained. It moves back and forth. So you can definitely read more about it in the environmental assessment. And I think I provided some links to that document. It appears for the parks what we've done in the park, the live removal seems to be the best, most viable option that we've found to date. There were other options looking at hazing, and then the lethal removal pilot project we did this year, which is kind of a form of hazing. But we think we get the most effective reduction in the number in the herd by that live capture. And it's also a really great relationship with the Intertribal Buffalo Council to supplement tribes herds or help build herds of bison with our tribal partners that may be interested in growing or supplementing their herd. So that will probably be our primary technique in the near future as we get closer to the goal of maintaining a herd around 200 bison.
Nice. And I do just have one question that's kind of attached to that. With the lethal cull, there was a lot of public outcry and misinformation about the program. Can you help clarify really quickly about how that program worked
Sure.
for everyone?
Yes, there was concern. Anytime with hunting, and especially species that are charismatic megafauna, it's controversial, and there were a lot of concerns about that. That was under development for many years, and as part of the environmental assessment, in collaboration with some of our partners like Game and Fish. And the way that the program worked was we partnered with the Arizona Game and Fish, and they kind of held a lottery system where there were over 40,000 applicants from across the United States that wanted to participate in the lethal call. And then the Game and Fish randomly selected 25 folks that had applied. And then there was a series of kind of interviews and screening those individuals to see what their background was. And then we selected 12 participants to come out, and they would spend a week at the park working with our staff to go out in the field. And we wanted, to make sure we were removing very specific animals from the population. So that is how that worked. And it was very delicate. There was a lot of conversations and back and forth about that. And those are never easy management options. So let me know if there's other questions that come in the chat, or folks have additional questions. We can certainly talk about that.
I think we have one follow-up question. I'm going to pass it on to Chris here. And that is just, Sarah, is there any information on how well the relocated bison are doing in their new neighborhoods?
Yeah, so far, the feedback we have gotten is very positive, that they're thriving. Some of the females have already bred on their new locations. Sometimes we get little videos from the tribes with pictures of how they're doing. And I believe that none of that, there were no fatalities with those bisons that have been relocated, as far as I know. I'll caveat that with, I don't have the most up-to-date knowledge, but they seem to be doing very well in their translocated lands.
Thank you. And I'm going to pass it on to Chris for Joel.
All right. Joel, so a number of us on here to do shorter day tours as opposed to multi-day trips. So question, do you have any tips and tricks of good ways or activities or prompts that we can utilize with our participants to help develop that sense of place and that engagement on a really short part day tour?
Sure. Well, there is the field of environmental ed and experiential ed, and we'll call it, either environmental ed, outdoor experiential ed, it's got some history. It really has its roots back to the 60s with folks like Steve Van Mater and Joseph Cornell. And there is a plethora of environmental ed, outdoor-based environmental ed activities that you can access, I'm sure, online now. So I would encourage you not to reinvent the wheel, but to go find parts of that wheel that you want to roll on, because there's a lot of them out there. And it's good to have a few tips and tricks in your back pocket. And again, I think research shows that when teachers find an activity that works for them, it's more likely to work for the students. So make sure you find activities that you feel comfortable with and that really connect with you, who you are as an educator, and that will increase your success dramatically. If it just doesn't feel right for you, then say this was, then put it aside and look for something else. But I think as outdoor educators, it's really, it makes a big difference, and you can increase your effectiveness greatly by having your own little mini library in your head or even in your field notebook of activities that you get to do over and over again and refine their effectiveness. And I think that uh, facilitating sense of place activities that require your participants to really connect with the landscape through their senses can be really impactful. I know that, if you're, part of me is kind of a hardcore scientist, and I do field-based environmental restoration and stuff. And I know that it's not uncommon to view the sensory activities as fluff, as thinking that, well, it's just a game. But, research has shown that emotional connections with landscape is really, really important. And many participants really have not spent that much mindful time in a landscape, even in their own neighborhood. And so if you can help them to spend some really mindful time in the Grand Canyon landscape, and then the key is that then help encourage them to do the same thing at home. So the Grand Canyon might be the first time, for example, that they sit with their eyes closed and really listen and identify all the different sounds they can hear. So there's one Joseph Cornell activity called Centered Sounds, where you have participants sit in a spot. They get to pick the spot, right? So it's their spot that they've chosen. You don't assign it, they pick it. And they sit with their eyes closed, and you ask each participant in their own spot with their eyes closed to identify all the different sounds. And they just sit for a while. You get to determine the time frame, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and they just identify all the different sounds. And then you ask them to open their eyes and describe all those different sounds and what they think they were, but more importantly, the description of the sounds. And then they switch, and then they kind of rotate 180 degrees and do the same thing. And then you have your participants kind of compare their list of sounds and how they describe them. That's one way to really have them connect with a place. And you can be damn sure that no one's done that in their neighborhood. Very few people sit and really listen to the sounds that their neighborhood produces or conveys to them. Another fun activity, and I've seen students really have a gas with this, is guided micro hikes. And you have students really get down to the ground and establish and kind of create a plan for taking another student on a micro hike where you go explore underneath plants, around the backside of cacti. You get to find ant hills or beetles or everything that's like just a few inches above the ground. And they come up with a plan to take a fellow participant on their micro hike, and everybody gets to kind of have some pride in the creativity and adventure of their micro hike. So just a few examples of ways you can help students to connect in a sensory way with the landscape. But there's a lot of curriculum out there to choose from.
Thanks, Joel. That's great. I've definitely used a bunch of those, like using other senses besides just what you see, the smell, the hear. And I think, like you said, people don't do that in their normal backyard every day. And I think it's a really great tool to help people engage, be mindful about their engagement with an environment. Yeah, great question. Kay, you're up.
Yes, I have another question for Tom. It was a question submitted beforehand. It says, I've heard if you've experienced heat-related illness or hydration-related illness, you are more susceptible to experiencing that again. Could you offer more insight on this?
Not a lot, but that is true. And usually it's with the realm of heat stroke. If you've had that and you survive, unfortunately, those people might be predisposed in some level to have it recur easier than someone who hasn't had it. Other heat exhaustion like dehydration, that if it's treated and it doesn't, it's slipped down that continuum into heat stroke, I don't think there's any correlation that you're going to have any higher risk for it. It's just use other factors to mitigate you becoming dehydrated in the future. But those who've had heat stroke, you bet, they are high risk. So you have to be extra vigilant for them to keep them cool. Like, it doesn't mean they can't go down there, but choosing the right time of the year, the time of day, and then measures to stay cool is really important.
Great, thank you. This next question is for Jack and Eric. Someone submitted a question that says, I've heard that some of the canyon walls in Glen Canyon are more crumbly and unstable as the water has dropped. Could you shed light on this? Would you say that extra caution needs to be used when visiting some of these re-emerging places?
So we don't know a ton about this, but I wouldn't say that extra caution is needed. I have seen places where, you kind of see the bathtub ring in certain parts of the reservoir and big chunks of it where it has flaked off. And I know that there's been some concern with, the Navajo sandstone. It's already so porous, and after being super saturated with water for a long time, would that make it weaker? And I know that there's been some concern about that, but I don't think it's very widespread. There was a bathymetry study that was done across the whole stretch of the reservoir to look at the elevations and get an idea of where the sediment has been accumulating. And there are a couple spots where you kind of see it trends down like this, and then there's like a big spike. And it's speculated that pieces of the walls, the canyon walls, might have fallen off into the reservoir that are underwater. And so that we might see that, as the reservoir continues to come down, we might see more evidence of that. But I don't think it's as much of a concern for, everyday visitors.
I would add too that a lot of the kind of sediment and surveys we've done in some of the canyon tributaries, as well as on the main stem, different places are behaving differently depending on how long they were underwater. But yeah, I wouldn't say widespread. We've seen like big pieces of canyon walls coming off. There certainly are more kind of crumbly places, but I wouldn't say it's any more so than you just see in normal kind of desert zones. The one place where we do take a lot of caution is when we're in the upper section of Glen Canyon and Lower Cataract Canyon, where some of these big sediment banks have been out of water for, in some cases, up to like almost 30 years. And in those zones, when you're walking on what we call the Domini Formation, you do need to be really careful of the Domini sort of cracking and crumbling and slumping off. So if you find yourself up in like Dark Canyon or Clearwater Canyon, those are amazing places to see restoration, but they also are places that have kind of a really interesting landscape that can be sort of hazardous if you're not paying attention. We sort of treat it like avalanche terrain almost.
Great, thank you. I do have a follow-up question to the previous question. Do you have any tips or suggestions for those of us who are eager to explore the re-emerging Glen Canyon?
There are a couple ways to do it. You can go float down Cataract Canyon, and everything below Big Drop 3 is the restoration zone. So everywhere below that is kind of new emerging territory. You can also rent a boat from Waweep or Bullfrog and go explore via the reservoir, which is more expensive and fuel intensive. You can also hike into a lot of these places. So a popular place, at least for us Utah folks on the northern end of the reservoir, is to come in through the Escalante canyons up from the Hole in the Rock Road. From there, you can hike down into Coyote Gulch and get down to the Escalante River drainage, and everything below the confluence of Coyote Gulch and the Escalante is the restoration zone. So there are some opportunities for some backpack access as well.
I've got some kind of copy that we've had a lot of folks ask about this, and I can feel free to reach out to our kind of normal Glen Canyon info account. I can provide some more detail on how to get in there, depending on what kind of trip you want to take and what you want to see.
Great, thank you. I'm sure a lot of people will use that resource and appreciate it. I'm going to pass it to Laura.
All right, thank you. And we've got some paleontology questions. It's two. One, how often are new species discovered? How often are new species discovered using fossils in Grand Canyon? And what do you find to be the most exciting thing working as a paleontologist for the park?
That's a good question. As far as new species, not very common. I would say we've potentially found a new species last year of trilobite. We're still working on identifying some of our plant species, and some of those may also be brand new. So as far as brand new species, that's a little bit more rare to occur, but we are finding new fossils. So fossils of known species that we already know about, or maybe are also pretty rare in the canyon. And those, sometimes we end up finding multiple fossils on any given trip that we're surveying in an area. And we'll find brand new fossils that no one's ever seen before. So that's definitely a lot more common. Of course, we are targeting areas that we know usually contain fossils. And so, yeah, that's actually been ramping up in the past few years. And I would say the most exciting thing, that's such a tough one. It's kind of like that favorite child's question, because each fossil is so unique and tells a specific story of that particular formation and what happened at that time. So for me specifically, I really enjoyed the Cambrian period and looking at those trace fossils. I'm a little bit biased because I wrote my thesis on those. But learning through that process really helped me to appreciate what trace fossils really mean and what they can tell you about the paleoecology of that environment. And I'm also biased to the Cambrian because it's over 500 million years old. So it's definitely one of the oldest rocks that we have that contain these fossils in the canyon. And I think that that geologic deep time is really hard to grasp. And I really, really enjoy kind of sitting in the canyon and enjoying the soundscapes, but also taking my mind back to that time period and imagining what the soundscapes might have been like, what the environment might have looked like, and what critters might be running around. So I kind of do this other type of meditation where I'm like in this geologic past. And I think that's definitely my favorite part about discovering a fossil and just kind of seeing what it looks like in the rock, but also imagining what it could have looked like in person and what it was doing in this area. Yeah, I would say that's my favorite part.
Thank you. That's awesome. No, it's a great way of, it's a sense of place. It's connection to the deep geologic time of what Grand Canyon is. So thanks. Sarah, we do have a question in the Q&A that I think it's about, did the meat from the cold bison go to native tribes to eat, or how was it used? And what about the hides? So the animal, the whole animal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. And yeah, during the cull operations, we had several, all of the meat that was harvested was utilized. Some of it went to the volunteers that were out in the field. A lot of it went to some of our tribal partners, including some donations of head and hives, hooves, other parts of the bison that are important to tribal partners for ceremonial purposes. So we definitely try to utilize absolutely as much of the bison meat and not leave anything out in the field except for you know, some of the gut piles and things that could be, you know, recycled by wildlife out in the field.
Thanks. And then just one more follow-up question since we're on those bison, is how far down have the bison ventured into the canyon? And do you ever think we will see them riverside? That picture, by the way, was stunning to see them.
Yeah.
I feel like elk don't even make it that far down. And
Yeah, that was below Powell Point. So they're definitely venturing below the rim. The question of whether we could ever see them by the river, that is a crystal ball question. I would think likely not, as they start to wander down, there's some concerns about riparian areas or, the damage that we've seen up on the plateau. If we get a bunch of bison following a riparian corridor, that could definitely, be a problem. They will, have less forage down there. There's some concerns about interaction, with bighorn sheep or disease transmission. So we aren't at the point where we have to address that yet, but I would say looking forward, we don't anticipate they'll wander that far down, but wildlife do interesting things as they're moving around and trying to find safe places to do their thing. So we're just gonna, we're keeping an eye on them. They're a very well studied population, so we'll have to monitor that. But they are definitely showing up underneath the rim in some unusual places.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to pass it off to Chris.
Thanks, Laura. All right, Joel, got another question that came in beforehand for you. It seems like biocentric and ecocentric views is a way to combat climate change. Do you think our society is capable of adopting more of a biocentric / ecocentric view of space before it is too late? And what is something that we can do personally?
Is that a trick question?
I don't think so.
No, it's never too late. I mean, it really is never too late. If you think it's too late, then and you're an educator, you're in the wrong profession. So, as outdoor guides, we're also environmental educators to some degree or another. And as such, I think it's really important to maintain an attitude and approach to our teaching that strives for a balance of both optimism and realism. Students can tell when you're sugarcoating stuff, and at the same time, again, like I said before, in response to one of the other questions, you don't want to go straight to the really difficult, complex, seemingly unresolvable problems. If you start there with your students, they're just going to think, oh boy, this is another environmentalist that is bumming me out. So help them to connect with the landscapes first. And, there's a lot of research out there that shows how important it is to get people out to explore landscapes and experience them firsthand and connect with them more deeply. This sets the foundation for a paradigm shift to a more bio and ecocentric value set. And in fact, this is just what, all of the guides do. All the Grand Canyon Conservancy and Field Institute guides are in the profession of, or in the position, a very unique and powerful position of helping their participants lay a foundation for awareness and appreciation and connection with the landscape in Grand Canyon. And as I said before, hopefully they'll transfer that back home and care for that place as well. Best case scenario, they care for them both. And I think that getting folks out to experience a landscape firsthand and doing it as a professional educator is probably one of the most important steps we can take to help kind of turn the ship towards a more ecocentric, biocentric value set. So that's one of the reasons I've been so just intrigued with the field of adventure education. I think it's an incredibly powerful and timely field to be in because we can help folks, we can make a difference in terms of helping the mainstream society connect with these ideas of ecocentrism and biocentrism.
Thanks, Joel. I would tend to agree with everything you just said there. Yep, perfect. Thank you so much. Kay, you're up.
Yes, I have another question for Tom. What is your opinion of the growing popularity of rim to rim to rims and the threat to participant safety?
Well, I think that, nobody should really run or venture down to the canyon on a whim. I think if people want to do that, I'll be the last to cast a stone at them because I did my first rim to rim to rim in a day. Shoot, that was like almost 40 years ago. I was a young man and I'd been hiking, but, so it's doable. And I think if somebody has prepared for it, runners and ultra marathoners, those kind of folks, or they've done hiking the Grand Canyon and they have a good sense of what they're getting into, I'm okay with it personally. I just don't like that if they're rude about it on a personal level. It's like if somebody comes running up me, there can be sometimes like a sort of the obnoxious tailgater, when you're driving, they come on you and want you to hop out of the way. So use good etiquette on the trail and let people know that you're barreling down on them or barreling up on them. And those guys who do it, make sure they're, they're smart about it. They bring what they need for food and water, and they do it the right time of the year, and try not to end up as a casualty.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
My next question is for Jack and Eric. With states renegotiating the Colorado River Compact, are they still considering the Phil Mead first proposal? Sorry.
Publicly, no, and privately, yes. I think the story here is that everything is being considered right now, and so much is changing in Colorado River policy that all of the foundations of decision-making in previous years are becoming less relevant. And so these types of proposals are being considered in one form or another. One thing that came about in the most recent AMWIG meeting that Ed Keeble was talking about is the Bureau of Reclamation just issued a feasibility study to look at putting hydropower turbines at the lower elevation outlets for the reservoir. So that is an indication to the public that they are preparing for a dead pool scenario. I don't know if that feasibility study is looking at full bypass around the dam, which is what we have been advocating for looking at. But it's very clear that everyone in the basin is considering options that were at one point considered outside of the box. So, there's a lot of challenges with the Colorado River. There's just not as much water as the plans are built on. And it's creating challenges, but it's also creating opportunities. So I think folks are beginning to look at everything.
Great, thank you. I am going to pass it to Laura.
All right, Anne. Can you provide some additional information around tribal concerns around electrofishing and what has been done to address this?
I might ask Sarah to answer that one. Okay. I don't know if that's a good one for me.
Yeah. I can talk about that. Maybe we can swap out for another question for Anne. So I'll just preface this by saying, I'm not the best person to answer this question. I'm not a member of any of our associated tribes, but what I'll try to explain is from the Park Service perspective, that we do electrofishing in Bright Angel, and we might be doing electrofishing in some other areas of the park to manage our fisheries species. And there were concerns, especially from the Zuni tribe, about taking of life. Many of our tribal partners have deep roots to the aquatic system in the park, and it's sacred to them and their histories. So through our consultations about managing different species in the park and the use of electrofishing, there were some stated concerns. So how we've addressed that is try to utilize any fish that we take out of the system to the maximum extent that we can for beneficial use. So that means either that they are consumed by staff, by people in the field when we have to remove those fish, such as brown and rainbow trout that can really have a detrimental impact on our native species. We've flown out thousands of pounds probably of fish to be fed to eagles for ceremonial purposes. The eagles are used for ceremonial purposes, and so the fish feed those eagles that are associated with some of our tribes. So that is one way we've really tried to listen to that concern and address it in our management actions. And we've been very successful, especially along Bright Angel, in utilizing the fish removed for those purposes. And it has helped to mitigate some of those concerns, not 100%, but it was a it was a partnership in trying to address that to the best that we could.
Thank you. Thank you for the response. While I've got you on here, I think this Q&A in the Q&A box might be for you, Sarah. And if we need to come back to this question or email them later, we definitely can. In the light of the White Sands National Park human footprint studied last year that were dated between 21,000 and 23,000, has there been any shift in thought when the earliest human visitation habitation of the Grand Canyon area occurred, and or are there any new studies planned?
That is a good question. I haven't heard of any studies, and might be able to weigh in on this. I mean, as far as the cultural record that we know of, we think it's 10,000 to 12,000 years of habitation for ancestral Puebloans and earlier folks that have utilized the park for thousands of years. I have not heard of any planned studies or proposed studies here in the park. I don't know, Anne, do you know anything, or you want to weigh in on this one?
No, I'm not sure. That might be a better question for our cultural resources specialist.
Okay, thank you. And Anne, I do have a question that I can definitely ask you. I just lost it. Oh, you mentioned there are some really cool new geology projects happening. Do you know when the results of those studies will be published, or is there a timeline?
That is a good question, and that's always a tough one. I would say just within the next couple years, we're hoping to get more results, especially with the Cambrian studies that are going on. Those are being actively studied right now, and they're getting results. They're starting to get results. So that I'm sure those results will come out in the next couple of years. Anyone that's working on a PhD, we're looking at probably 4 to 5 years as far as their final results and anything that's actually published. I am currently working on a paper that I mentioned in my talk about the arthropod trackways, and I'm hoping to submit that this year if I can. So some of these publications may be coming out in the next year or so, but it is hard to say with everything else going on with all these other projects. These are sort of like the side things that we do, and we're mostly dependent on the actual researchers from outside the park that are working on those things. So that's kind of the best answer I can give there.
Cool, thank you. And then just where are places that people could find them? Does NPS publish them publicly? Is there a place on our website or on GERCA's website that we would be able to find it? So where would people be able to find that information?
Yeah, we actually just published an intensive inventory report where we talk about each formation and the fossils that are in each formation. Each chapter in that report is categorized by fossil type, so invertebrate fossils or vertebrate fossils, those types of things. And that can be found on the NPS website. And I could send you that link if anyone else wants that resource. But that's a really great start because it sort of covers everything that was published in 2019. So there's a little bit more that we've discovered since then, but that definitely covers sort of the history of paleontology in the park, and also some more recent discoveries as well that we've had. As far as actual fossils, we do have a museum collections. They're not taking tours right now because of COVID-19, but on occasion they do take public tours where you can look through some of those collections. There's also the Geology Museum, which has a little bit of fossil collections that we have on display, and we're hoping to in the future to display more fossils in like the visitor center and different places like that. But otherwise, I would definitely refer to sort of the end of my talk where I talk about those 3 areas where you can take visitors to look at fossils, because those are fossils you see right in the field. And to me, that's a really good way for visitors to appreciate those resources and hopefully respect them at our park and future parks that they visit.
Thank you. All right, so I'm gonna pass it on to Chris and Joel.
Okay, Joel, you mentioned a couple times in your presentation about how water flows uphill to money and power. It's a question that came in, and somebody would like a little bit more information about why that is, maybe for some of us who haven't studied the water in the West as extensively.
All right, well, I can be darn sure that Jack and Eric would want to chime in on this, but you do read that. I think I remember seeing in one of the Cadillac Desert video documentaries, it was Mark Reisner who says that several times, both in his book and in documentary, that Western water flows uphill to money, and it's kind of a cute metaphor, but it's physically true. I mean, we actually pump water up thousands of feet and thousands of miles, and in fact, that is probably the one distinguishing feature of our strategy for managing Western water that John Wesley Powell would be absolutely he'd be beside himself that we decided to go this route, because Powell was all about just keeping the water where it is and having the population density and distribution in these arid states basically kind of be commensurate and mimic the surface water, and not move water or people around, or excuse me, not move the water around to the people, but move the people to the water. And we have such an energy intensive system right now, and it's all about moving water to groups, to huge populations that decided to grow where there was no water. So right now, we move Colorado River water to LA, we move it to Denver, and we move it to Phoenix and Tucson. And none of those places are near the Colorado River. So we spend a lot of fossil fuels moving water around. And not only do we move it from one region to another, but we pump it up from aquifers to the surface. And then we even pump it up from the aquifers. We pump Colorado River water down into the aquifers, and then we pump it back up again. It's nuts how much we move water around. And all of that takes fossil fuels. So, and typically when we move water around, it's the people that that have political power and wield political power and have the money to pay for it that get it. And California gets the lion's share of Colorado River water. They get more Colorado River water than anybody, about twice as much as what Arizona gets, because they were first in line with prior appropriation, and they just had a lot of money. So water truly does flow uphill to money and power. We pump it under the Continental Divide to Denver. It only gets a few hundred miles, if that far, before we pump Colorado River water under the Continental Divide to the Denver Metropolitan District. And of course, Phoenix and Tucson, we pump it, we pump it 3,000 feet up and 300 miles to get it to Tucson. So water flows uphill to money and power, and that's not a metaphor.
Yeah, Eric, Jack, would either of you like to chime in on that?
I think one other important perspective, I mean, Joel described it perfectly, and I think it's important to remember too that Colorado River tribes have a pre-compact allocation of 1/5 of the river, right? So they have a senior water right to many of the states, and traditionally they have not been able to access this water for the very reason that Joel was talking about, and that's money for infrastructure. And so as the whole system of the Colorado River is being renegotiated right now, I think it's really interesting and inspiring to see the tribes playing a bigger role. And I think it's just a perspective that a lot of us kind of didn't appreciate before, and now it's really coming to light. And so, yeah, I think as Colorado River is renegotiated, how do we make it more equitable, not just flowing to those interests with the most money? I think that's an important consideration.
Yeah, it's absolutely amazing to see prior appropriation combined with the Winters Doctrine to be just divine retribution. I mean, all of a sudden, a lot of these tribal nations are first in line.
Yeah, that's true. And it's something that I think is not talked about a lot that I think should be talked about more. So thanks for bringing that one up. Good point, everybody.
Can I ask a quick follow-up question on that? Is Mexico part of those negotiations?
Mexico will be a part of those negotiations. I believe it was in 1944, the treaty with Mexico was passed that allocated them 1.4 million acre feet. And Mexico and the US have had a really good working cooperative relationship, especially amidst the drought years, minute 319 and minute 323. Mexico's held some of its water in Lake Mead as an intentionally created surplus. And in exchange, the US has helped Mexico upgrade some of their infrastructure. And that's actually increased system efficiency. So it's been one of the success stories of the Colorado River. So they are definitely involved.
Great, thank you. Good question, Laura, appreciate that. Before I throw it back over to Kay, I just want to mention to all of our panelists and everybody who's watching, we're just gonna go around the horn one more time. Everybody else get one more question as we're getting closer to 12. So if you got a question that you haven't asked yet, now's the time to get it in. So Kay, over to you.
Great. So my last question I have for Tom is kind of a scenario question. Someone submitted a question and described the situation beforehand. They said, on and off, I have clients who don't want to rest very long at 3 mile rest house or 1.5 mile rest house because they don't want to lose their forward momentum and don't want their body to turn from exercise mode to shutdown mode. So I think they're referring to hiking from the bottom of the canyon to the rim. Their participants want to keep going even when someone in the group is battling with heat or energy issues. I bring up that they're hot, need to cool down and rest, especially the person who's having trouble. But is there a flip side that they might be partially right and it's hard for the body to catapult between extreme exercise and long rest? And could you provide your insight on this?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that a lot of it has to be to each their own. One strategy for that is somebody can actually get some water at 3 mile house or 1.5 mile house and wet themselves down as they maybe slow their pace down and cool off, just like running a marathon, right? Or half marathon. People don't stop. They might go to the aid station and just get a snack or some water and cool themselves off. So doing that, and then even maybe eating a little bit as they walk, and like a granola bar or something like that. I think that's totally appropriate. I wouldn't force people to stop, because one of the things for sure is people who aren't really in shape or have trained for it, they'll get a lot of lactic acid buildup in the muscles, and then you sit and there's all this inflammation and stuff that settles in those muscles, and then they get up and it's like, oh my God, they're trying to, get that engine going again, and they're moving like a sloth. So trying not to lose that momentum. Yeah, I get it. And they can, again, try to mitigate some of that by just maybe cool themselves off as they slow their walk and eat a little bit. So, yeah.
Great, thank you. I think a lot of us have probably experienced that time where you take a break and then start moving again and your legs feel heavy and you feel more tired. So those are helpful tips. Thank you. My next question is for Jack and Eric. It's kind of a fun one. What do you guys find to be most exciting about Glen Canyon restoring itself?
I think for me is just the scale of it, the scale and the speed. Obviously, I am very interested in Glen Canyon and have been rooting its restoration for a long time. And even I didn't think that we would see it happen as quickly as it's happening. Obviously, the changes happening in the Colorado River are cause for concern in other ways and creates a whole bunch of challenges. And we don't want to, relish in the challenges that are coming up. But what's happening in Glen Canyon is really fascinating. Cathedral in the Desert, for example, is one of the crown jewels of Glen Canyon. And we saw it come out last spring. The new floor of the Cathedral in the Desert come out, right? It's filled with 50 feet of sediment, which was amazing. And then after the flash floods of the monsoons over the summer, that sediment mound, half of it got washed away down to the original level of the floor of the cathedral. And on that spring trip, I was with some folks from USGS, and we were all kind of speculating how long it would take for the sediment to move out of Cathedral. And one of them, he was like, oh, that'll take years. I don't think it'll ever come out. And to see it get washed out in one, monsoon season was just eye-opening. And when I went there in the fall, I was walking into the cathedral, and there was an 8-point stag deer standing on that sediment wall in Cathedral in the desert, just waiting there all by itself. And it was just the most amazing thing. So yeah, it's so incredible to see what's happening down there. And I would encourage anyone who can make the time to go visit it while the water's low. I would highly encourage it.
For me, it's really similar in the way of just going out in some of these side canyons that people aren't looking at in the same way. And some people haven't even been in since the, mid 60s. And so we kind of feel like astronauts going to this kind of foreign place to go and survey the change and just exploring the regions. And it's really cool, just from the sake of like getting out into canyons that people haven't been in for a long time. But I really like talking about it. Like it's this sort of double-edged sword of a place that, is a huge indicator of this pretty scary moment we're having with aridification in the West. But it's also a time where we can really rethink how our relationship with water and with land, and think about a better strategy for the future, looking down the road how we live and use resources here in the Southwest. So it's kind of like it's a scary moment, but it's also kind of a beautiful one, for the sake of the actual restoration of the canyon, as well as thinking about how we utilize our resources. So I kind of like to think about it as just like a silver lining of what's happening across the landscape. And yeah, I echo Eric. If you can make time and have the resources to get out there, either in the Upper Canyon in the Cataract Zone or down into especially the Escalante Arm, it's a really cool, rapidly changing landscape that's really beautiful and a really interesting look at both natural landscape as well as a thing of the Anthropocene.
Great, thank you. I like ending on that hopeful note, knowing that some of the damages we've done, some of it is reversible, and it will come back. So thank you for sharing. Laura, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, thank you. Water is a powerful source. It's amazing. And so we do have a question about bats here. For areas experiencing the effects of white nose syndrome since 2006, has there been any recovery of the bat population? Or are we possibly seeing the beginning of a decline in bat species?
Sarah, should I refer that one to you? She's a little bit more aware of the current situation. What do you think?
Yeah, well, yeah, white nose syndrome has definitely been devastating to a lot of bat populations in the US, especially in the East. 90% plus die off, sometimes total elimination of colonies. But it hasn't, taken out a species at this point, and there is some recovery, some indications, that the colonies that could survive it will grow back. So, it is very serious, but I wouldn't get too bleak on it. I think for the canyon, we have a really unique situation. Although we haven't detected white nose syndrome, we have detected the fungus in very small amounts that causes white nose syndrome. We haven't seen indications of the disease yet in our bat populations. But our bats, we have 22 species, and they don't roost like those overwintering colonies in the East. Usually they're in really small numbers in cracks and crevices. So they also were surprising data that's coming out of some of our monitoring is that there's some winter activity that we're detecting by acoustic monitors, even up, on the rims in the wintertime. And there's such a huge elevational gradient that bats can forage even in the wintertime. They can, drop down in minutes to get to the river and find insects to eat. So they may be set up to do better with white nose just because they're not in these overwinter hibernacula with thousands and thousands of bats. They're more isolated, and they have potential, if they did get white nose, to forage and kind of fight off that starvation mode that white nose can initiate in bats. So we'll see, but we're staying hopeful, and we're watching this closely in our bat populations in the canyon.
Yeah. And so a question on that winter activity, do we know why there's bat winter activity happening? Is it related to climate change, or is it just something that?
Yeah, it's hard to know. I mean, I asked the bat biologist, Brandon Holton, about that, and he said when he was picking up winter activity, it was in these warmer periods of time. So it just might be that, bats are, queuing into warmer times of the winter, or these heat waves that come in the winter and getting up and getting a snack and going back. So, I think there's a lot of impacts or changes we're going to see from climate change. It may be related to that, but we don't have a long enough data set to know exactly, maybe that's just, normal winter activity for bats in the Grand Canyon area, because they have so many options for foraging and dipping into lower habitats. So it may be something that they've just adapted to in their life histories here in the canyon.
Okay. And then one last time, would you be able to just repeat to folks, if we do see bats behaving oddly or things like that, how can,
Sure.
especially if we're out there guiding, how can we tell someone?
Right. So it kind of depends. I think that if you're, in the canyon and you're near a ranger station, don't wait, especially if it's, a bat acting strangely in the daytime, or if there's contact with a bat on your body, even if there's no indication that there was a bite, if they touch you, you really do need to seek medical attention fairly quickly. So don't wait on that. Even if you don't think you were bitten, any contact with a bat, any human, is a potential exposure to rabies. But if there's nobody to tell, if you can't get to a ranger in Indian Havasupai Gardens or down in the canyon, or you don't see anybody right away, then letting Brandon know, and his contact information is in my presentation as soon as you possibly can, about what happened and what you witnessed and observed. That would be really useful. But like I said, if you have contact, or it's in the day, or you can get to a ranger, they can initiate that conversation pretty quickly through radio and phone with Brandon, and then maybe we could respond to the area in a quicker way.
Okay, thank you. And Anne, I do have a question for you. How many fossils have we found in the Cambrian layer, or in that layer of the Cambrian period?
Just in the Cambrian, so we're talking three different formations.
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry, during the Cambrian period. Yeah.
I would have to look at my data to get an exact number, but we have several localities, many of which I found during my thesis work. So I found many trace fossils. I would say hundreds of fossils that we found in the Cambrian. And most of those are trace fossils, specifically in the Bright Angel Shale and the Tupets sandstone. Those have a lot of trace fossils, a lot of variety and diversity of trace fossils. And it's really interesting because it tells you a lot about what those animals were doing when they were alive. And it's really hard to preserve actual body fossils in a place where trace fossils are being preserved. It's a different kind of preservation. So usually when body fossils are preserved, they're transported or buried rapidly, or they're disarticulated, broken up, and things like that. And so that kind of environment can't preserve a trace fossil. And so that's why we tend to get a lot more trace fossils in these formations like the Bright Angel Shale and Tupets formation. But we do have a collection of body fossils from those formations as well, mainly from the Bright Angel Shale and a little bit from the Muav. And we're looking at a decent number of mainly trilobites, but also different things like brachiopods and hyolithids and different marine invertebrate fossils. But I would say the trace fossil assemblage in the Cambrian is much higher than the body fossil assemblage.
Cool, thank you. And we do have a question in the Q&A chat about bison for Sarah, and I'm gonna, after that, I'll pass it off to Chris and Joel for our last question. So why was the lethal elimination of the bison made so public with the lottery? Has this kind of lottery ever been done before for controlling other species?
Yeah, so was the first part of your question, why was it made so public?
That is, yes, that was the first part of that question. Why was the lethal elimination of the bison made so public with the with the lottery?
Right. So there are other examples. The one that really comes to mind are the elk in Rocky Mountain National Park. They have kind of a similar public open system for recruiting skilled volunteers. And I think that the way that the program happened here was in just consultation with the Arizona Game and Fish. They wanted to, open up that opportunity to be involved in the cull as widely as possible. So it was well publicized, for anybody who would want to take part in that. And clearly there was a huge interest in it with, over 40,000 applicants to the lottery. And I think that was just a negotiation with the state on how, because originally the bison herd was kind of under the management of the Game and Fish, and we want to partner with the Arizona state on how we, ultimately need to manage bison on the park. That it was just made very, very public for as many people to potentially participate in and learn about management as possible.
Thank you. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Chris for our last question.
All right, Joel, last question. This might be the hardest one of the day. What is your favorite ecoregion and why?
Oh, please. I thought you were going to ask me my other question. What's my favorite ecoregion? Well, I Grand Canyon. Grand Canyon is such a vertical landscape. It really is unique. It's a vertical landscape. It's both empowering and humbling. It is this amazing combination of both. It's empowering and it's humbling. And if you've been addicted to this, right? I mean, those of us who work in the Grand Canyon, we had this experience a while ago. And Ed and Darren, they both, they think back to their first experiences, and you want to share those first experiences. It's because they're so empowering. Well, our students or our participants many of them are having that first experience with you as a guide. Some of them are the repeat customers where they've been hooked like us. They just can't get enough of it because we're both empowered and humbled. So that's why I keep coming back to the Grand Canyon, because it empowers me and humbles me all in the same breath. But of course, the larger picture, Colorado Plateau, and I love my home in the central Arizona highlands, and I can never get enough of Baja.
Perfect. Thank you, Joel, for encapsulating the way that so many of us feel about this place. That's really wonderful. Thanks to all of our panelists. And with that, I'm going to throw it back over to Darren.
Thanks, everyone. Great 2022 seminar. I want to say a few thank yous, especially to our panelists and staff who pivoted from a planned live GTS to a webinar. Next year, we will do it live. I also want to thank Teresa and Ed for joining us. It was great conversation overall, and all of our participants. We had a good showing, lots of questions and dialogue, and I look forward to doing this again next year. Thank you all so much. It's really appreciated. Have a great day.